The Haunted Hospital. Hello friends, welcome to the horror ghost stories. The story begins. The walls of the old hospital were covered in peeling paint, the air thick with the stench of decay. Once a place of healing, it had become a mausoleum, its sterile halls now filled with memories of suffering and death. At night, the hospital seemed to come alive with the whispers of its past, echoing through the abandoned rooms. It had been years since anyone stepped foot inside, and the town had long since forgotten about the institution that had once been the center of medical advancements. Yet, some stories lingered, stories of patients who never left, of doctors who vanished without a trace, and of a strange, chilling presence that seemed to inhabit the building itself. One cold winter night, a group of friends dared each other to explore the haunted hospital. They were drawn by the thrill of the unknown, the lure of danger, and the promise of adventure. As they stepped into the dilapidated lobby, the air grew inexplicably heavy. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and the sound of their footsteps was swallowed by the thick silence. They moved cautiously through the halls, their flashlights flickering as they illuminated the once bright walls now covered in grime. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if something was watching them from the darkness. Whispers drifted through the corridors, too faint to make out but clear enough to send chills down their spines. They reached the elevator, an old iron box with rusted doors. It groaned as they pressed the button, but to their surprise, it opened. The elevator was small, just enough for the group to squeeze inside. Without a word, they piled in, and the door slammed shut with a jarring clang. The air inside felt colder than before, the temperature dropping as the elevator slowly ascended. The ascent was agonizingly slow, the cables groaning with every movement. As they passed each floor, the sense of dread intensified. They had come for a thrill, but now, an overwhelming sense of unease settled in. One of the friends, a skeptic, tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but the others were not so easily fooled. Their eyes darted nervously around the dim, flickering light of the elevator. When the doors finally opened, they were met with a scene that made their blood run cold. The floor was covered in old hospital beds, some overturned, others rusted and broken. The walls were lined with rusting medical equipment, forgotten for decades. But what struck them the most was the strange, unexplainable feeling that something was waiting for them, something just beyond their sight. They hesitated, but curiosity pushed them forward. They walked down the hall, the beams of their flashlights trembling in their hands. The temperature dropped further, their breath misting in the air. They entered a room at the end of the hall, its door creaking as it opened. Inside, the walls were covered in strange symbols, scrawled in what looked like dried blood. The floor was littered with shards of broken glass and abandoned medical tools. A sudden noise made them freeze. A low, guttural groan echoed from somewhere deeper in the hospital. It sounded like it was coming from the walls themselves. The sound grew louder, closer. Something was moving in the dark, something that had not been seen in years. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. Panic set in. They rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. The groaning grew louder, and then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was tall, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, empty and hollow. It moved toward them with unnatural speed, its limbs jerking and twitching as if they were not fully under its control. One of the friends screamed, and the creature paused, its head tilting to one side, as if intrigued by the sound. The others stood frozen, unable to move, their minds paralyzed by fear. The creature reached out a long, gnarled hand, its fingers twisting unnaturally as it dragged itself closer. Just as it seemed that escape was impossible, the door finally gave way, crashing open. They ran, their hearts pounding, tearing through the hallways, the sound of the creature's footsteps echoing behind them. But no matter how fast they ran, it felt like the creature was always just a step behind, its breath hot and rancid against their necks. They burst into another room, slamming the door shut behind them. Their breaths were ragged, and the terror was overwhelming. But as they gathered themselves, something caught their eye: a small window in the corner, just big enough for one person to crawl through. It was their only hope. One by one, they managed to squeeze through the window, emerging into the cold night air. But when the last friend tried to escape, something reached out from the darkness and dragged them back inside. The others screamed in horror, but by the time they turned to help, the door had slammed shut again, trapping them outside. The hospital was quiet once more. No one would ever return to its halls again, but the whispers of its dark past would never be forgotten. The thing that haunted those walls still roamed the empty corridors, waiting for the next group of fools to come and meet their fate. The group of friends had heard the stories about the haunted hospital for years. The locals spoke of strange occurrences, unexplained noises, and the chilling feeling that permeated the air around the building. It had been abandoned for decades, its reputation as a place of nightmares cemented by rumors that it was once the site of cruel experiments and eerie medical practices. But none of that had prepared them for the reality they were about to face. They had arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the last slivers of daylight fading into darkness. The once proud building loomed over them, an imposing, decaying structure. The windows were boarded up, but there were gaps between the boards, and through those gaps, the faintest glimmer of light could be seen. The hospital seemed alive, as if watching them, waiting for them to make their move. Despite the warnings, the group pressed forward, pushing through the rusted gate that had been left ajar. The entrance was shrouded in darkness, the thick trees around it blocking out much of the moonlight. As they stepped over the threshold, an eerie quietness settled over them. It was as if the very air in the hospital had been frozen in time, still and lifeless. They gathered their courage, holding their breath as they entered the main lobby. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew hung heavily in the atmosphere. There were old, abandoned wheelchairs scattered about, some with torn leather seats and broken wheels. A long, cracked marble counter stretched across one side of the room, and behind it, a receptionist's desk, now empty and decayed. The faint sound of water dripping echoed through the room, the only sound breaking the silence. The friends ventured deeper into the hospital, their footsteps reverberating in the hollow, cavernous space. Every creak of the old floorboards made them jump, every gust of wind that slipped through the broken windows made them shiver. Their flashlights flickered constantly, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. The building seemed to shift with every passing second, as though it was alive, pulsating with a presence that was both ancient and terrifying. As they reached the elevator, its metal doors groaned as they slowly opened, revealing a dark, narrow shaft. The group hesitated but then piled in together, desperate for something to break the tension that hung heavy in the air. The elevator moved slowly, its cables screeching as if in protest, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Every floor they passed seemed to echo with whispers, distant voices that seemed to rise and fall, like murmurs from another time. When the elevator doors finally opened on the third floor, the friends found themselves staring into a room that seemed to have been forgotten by time. Medical instruments were scattered across the floor: old scalpels, syringes, and rusty scissors. The walls were covered in peeling, yellowed paper, the once white plaster now covered in stains that looked like old blood. One of the friends, unable to contain their fear, reached for a nearby bed frame. It was broken, but beneath the rust, the faintest traces of a patient's name could still be seen. "Let's keep moving," one of them whispered, urging the others forward. "This place is seriously messed up." But even as they tried to move, something about the room felt wrong. The air grew thick, oppressive, and the walls seemed to close in on them. A distant sound filled the room, scratching, like nails on metal. The group turned toward the source of the noise, but all they could see was the empty hallway stretching before them. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. "Did you hear that?" one of the friends asked, voice trembling. But no one could answer. The footsteps had stopped, but the sense of something following them had only grown stronger. The silence that enveloped them now was suffocating, broken only by their nervous breathing. They turned back to the elevator, hoping to escape, but the door slammed shut with a thunderous crash. "What's happening?" someone shouted, their voice cracking with panic. "We need to get out of here, now." The elevator, once a means of escape, had become a prison. It jolted and groaned as it moved, the lights flickering wildly. The friends banged on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then, out of the corner of their eyes, they saw movement. A figure appeared at the end of the hallway, its form shrouded in darkness. The creature was tall, its limbs long and unnaturally bent. Its face was obscured by shadows, but there was something about its movement, jerky and disjointed, that sent waves of terror through their bodies. The figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing faintly, like pale lanterns in the dark. It let out a low, guttural moan, the sound of suffering and hunger combined. One of the friends screamed, backing away, but it was already too late. The creature lunged forward with blinding speed, its bony fingers reaching out toward them. The elevator shuddered violently, and the doors finally opened, revealing another long, desolate hallway. The group bolted, running as fast as they could, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound of the creature's footsteps echoed in the darkness behind them, growing louder and louder with each passing second. They rounded corner after corner, searching desperately for an exit, but the hospital seemed to stretch endlessly before them. No matter where they went, the oppressive feeling of being hunted never left. They found themselves trapped in a maze of dark, abandoned rooms. Every door they opened led to another room that seemed identical, each one darker and more oppressive than the last. One by one, the friends began to disappear. The creature seemed to be everywhere, its reach extending through the walls themselves. One friend was dragged into a room without a sound, another vanished as if swallowed by the shadows. The remaining group members, terrified but determined, tried to make their way toward the staircase, but the walls began to close in on them, the hospital itself shifting and warping. With every step, the horrors they had imagined seemed to become reality. The walls oozed with dark, sticky substance. The windows, once a source of light, were now covered in layers of grime and dirt. Their eyes were wide with fear as they sprinted down the stairwell, only to be met with more darkened hallways. Each turn led them to a new nightmare. The creature was always just out of sight, its presence ever looming, relentless in its pursuit. Finally, they reached the ground floor, hoping for an exit, but when they reached the doors, they found them locked, sealed shut as if by some dark force. They pounded on the glass, shouting, but no sound escaped. The only answer was the quiet, disembodied laughter of the creature echoing from the depths of the building. The last friend, breathless and covered in cold sweat, turned to face the others. It was too late. The hospital had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many others before. And somewhere in the dark, Deep within its walls, the creature waited for the next souls to wander in, ready to add them to its endless collection of lost and tormented souls. As dawn broke over the horizon, the hospital stood silent once more, its walls hiding the terrible secrets of its past. But the whispers of the lost souls still lingered, drifting through the air, calling to anyone foolish enough to enter. The friends hadn't planned for this, at least, not in the way they had imagined. They had come for a night of thrill, to test their courage against the stories that had been whispered about the old hospital for decades. But now, as they staggered through the hospital's darkened halls, fear coursing through their veins, they realized that their adventure had turned into a nightmare far beyond anything they had expected. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, dust, and something more sinister. It was the scent of decay, of things left to rot and be forgotten. They could hear the distant sound of water dripping, as if time itself was eroding the walls, and the occasional creak of old wood seemed to groan in protest beneath their feet. The building, though abandoned for years, seemed to retain a life of its own, as though the dark memories that had occurred within its walls were embedded into its very foundation. After the terrifying encounter in the room filled with medical instruments, they had tried to regain their composure. They moved cautiously through the hospital, unsure of where to go next. Their flashlights trembled in their hands, casting erratic shadows that stretched unnaturally along the walls, like ghostly arms trying to reach out and grab them. The deeper they went into the hospital, the more oppressive the air became, like a heavy weight pressing down on their chests. It was as if the building was alive, watching them, and the more they tried to ignore the ominous presence surrounding them, the stronger it became. As they passed through a crumbling hallway, one of the group noticed something odd, a faintly glowing light at the end of the corridor. It was coming from a room they hadn't seen before. The others were hesitant, but the allure of the light was too strong. They moved toward it, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that covered the floor. They reached the doorway, which was slightly ajar, and with a shared look of unease, they pushed it open. Inside, the room was bathed in an eerie, sickly green light. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The walls were covered in strange symbols, written in what appeared to be blood, dried and cracked over time. The floor was littered with tattered hospital gowns, some so old they looked as though they would disintegrate at a touch. At the center of the room, there was an old operating table, its metal surface corroded with rust, but it was clear that it had once been used for something far more sinister than medical procedures. As they stepped further into the room, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Panic set in. One of the friends rushed to the door, pulling at the handle with all their strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though something on the other side was holding it shut, preventing their escape. The air grew colder, and suddenly, they heard the sound of heavy breathing. Slow, deliberate, and uneven. It was coming from the shadows, from somewhere in the corners of the room. One of the friends whispered, "What is that?" but no one had an answer. The breath grew louder, heavier, as though something was drawing closer, its presence undeniable. They spun around, but the room was empty. At least, that's what they thought at first. Then, in the far corner, they saw a shadow moving unnaturally, shifting in ways that no human body should. The figure was hunched over, its back arched grotesquely, and its limbs were twisted, as though they had been bent in ways that were never meant to be. The thing's head hung low, and its long, spindly fingers scraped the floor as it crawled toward them with terrifying speed. The friends stood frozen, their bodies paralyzed by fear. The creature's eyes glowed in the dim light, bright, pale, and devoid of any emotion. It was as though it didn't see them as people, but as prey, something to be hunted and consumed. And in that moment, they realized with dread that the creature was not of this world, not in any way they understood. It was something ancient, something far older than the hospital itself, something that had existed in the darkness, waiting. The creature's mouth opened slowly, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It emitted a low, guttural growl that reverberated through their bones. Then, without warning, it lunged. The friends scattered, rushing toward the door, but it was too late. The thing was faster than they could have imagined. It grabbed one of them, its fingers sinking deep into their flesh, and in a single motion, it dragged them into the shadows. Screams filled the room as the remaining friends tried to pull the door open again, but it refused to give. It was as though the building itself was conspiring to keep them trapped inside. Panic surged through them as they realized they were being picked off one by one, each friend disappearing into the darkness, swallowed by the very thing that haunted the hospital. The last remaining friend, breathless and terrified, managed to pry the door open and staggered out into the hallway, desperate to escape. But no matter how fast they ran, the creature was always close behind. It was relentless, its footsteps echoing in the halls, growing louder with every turn. The friend made it to a stairwell, but as they rushed down the stairs, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The floor was covered in blood. It was fresh, not yet dried, and it seemed to lead in the direction they had just come from. The friends stopped, confused and terrified. They turned back, hoping for an escape, but all they saw were the dark corridors stretching ahead, endless and twisting, like some kind of maze that had no exit. The temperature dropped, and their breath came out in visible clouds. The walls closed in around them, growing tighter, as though the hospital itself was shrinking, trapping them within its dark embrace. Suddenly, there was another sound, a soft whisper. It wasn't he, the creature. This sound was different, almost human, but there was something horribly wrong about it. It was a voice, a low, raspy voice, that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. "Get out! Or join us!" The friends spun around, their heart hammering in their chest, but they saw nothing. Only the dim glow of their flashlight flickering erratically, casting long, jagged shadows. But as the light flickered once more, they saw it, figures, pale and gaunt, standing in the dark corners of the hallway. They were people, once, but now, they were something else entirely. Their eyes were hollow, and their skin hung from their bones like a forgotten corpse. They were trapped here too, lost souls who had never left the hospital. The friends stumbled backward, horrified by the sight. And then, from the darkness, the creature appeared again, its grotesque form looming over them. It reached out with its long, bony fingers, and in that moment, the friend understood. They weren't just running from the creature. They were running from the curse of the hospital itself, from the endless cycle of pain and suffering that had been trapped within its walls for centuries. The thing that hunted them was only the beginning. The real horror was the hospital, and it had no plans to ever let them leave. With a final scream, the friend was pulled into the darkness, their body joining the others in the eternal torment of the haunted hospital, where there would be no escape, no release. And as the doors to the building slowly creaked shut once more, the whispers of the lost souls filled the air, waiting for the next unsuspecting victims to stumble upon the cursed building, drawn to their doom. The end.